And it is 2:01, so we'll do a little bit of round of introductions to kind of give people more time to be able to get on. First off, my name is Harley Moore Wilson. I am on contract with the Native American Agricultural Services. I will be the presenter today, so I will go into a more in-depth um, background of myself later on in the presentation. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the rest of my team to introduce themselves, and then Miss Mariel from the Farmer Veteran Coalition will introduce herself, and then we'll get started into the presentation. So Ridge, would you like to give an introduction to yourself?
Yes, it's good to talk with all of you today. My name is Ridge Howell, and I'm legal counsel for Native Agriculture Financial Services based out of Fayetteville, Arkansas. And I'm here remotely in Tulsa, Oklahoma right now.
Ty?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ty Duchino. I came on with Native Agriculture Financial Services in May as a lending analyst, and I work remotely from South Dakota.
Miss Sandy?
Thanks, Harley. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sandy Martini, Chief Operating Officer at Native Agriculture Financial Services, and I'm calling in today from Arkansas. Looking forward to chatting with everyone later on in our breakout rooms.
And Miss Mariel, would you like to give an introduction about yourself and maybe a little bit more about the Farmer Veteran Coalition?
Of course. My name is Mariel Petznick, and I am the state chapter coordinator for the Farmer Veteran Coalition. Farmer Veteran Coalition works to serve veteran farmers across the United States, bringing them resources and support. They served their country in the military, and now they're serving their country, providing food for their communities. And so that is what our organization does, and we're happy to work with NAFS and this endeavor.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for doing that round of introductions. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping and let you know how today's session is going to work. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. At the very end of this main presentation, we'll have a little QR code on the screen so that you guys could take a post survey before we go into breakout rooms. And these breakout rooms are going to be more of an interactive discussion. You guys will be able to turn your cameras on and have face-to-face interaction as much as Zoom will allow, and it will go into more of a case study scenario. And so this is just going to be a basic overview of food safety, and then that case study breakout session will be more interactive with some more detailed case studies that are very relevant to what is happening today. Each of the case studies that will be presented are things that are happening across the United States this October. I mean, literally less than a week ago, some of these recalls are occurring. And so we just want to inform you guys and help as much as possible. So like I said, my name is Harley Moore Wilson. We are presenting on food safety basics. So we're trying to help farmers and producers understand why food safety is important and how it can help benefit your production. Maybe if I can get the thing to turn. So this is brought to you today from the Native Agricultural Financial Services and the Farmer Veteran Coalition. And the agenda today is, we gave you a little bit about us. Miss Sandy is going to go a little bit more in depth about NAFS in just a second. I will give you more of a detailed overview of myself. We'll go over some overview of food safety, what is food safety, how it matters, management or mitigation of food safety risks. I'll give you our contact information. At the very end, I will address the questions that are in the chat before going into the breakout sessions. So these are just the vision and mission of the Native Agricultural Financial Services. And basically We're an agricultural lending and native ag, and we just want to make sure that native agricultural individuals have access to capital. And Miss Sandy is going to give you a little bit more about NAFS.
Thanks, Harley. First of all, I want to thank our funders for this risk management project and for this webinar series that we're doing, and that is the Extension Risk Management Centers in the West, in the South, and in the North Central. And Harley's going to go over a little bit more on that later and show you exactly where they're located. But Native Agriculture Financial Services is a partner in lending, and where we aim to fill a gap, missing access to capital across Indian country and across all underserved farmers and ranchers. And we also provide technical assistance. And when I say technical assistance, it's like this risk management webinar series, anything to help farmers and ranchers mitigate their risk and help them make the most profit that they can on their operation. And so as we go through these series and you learn about all of the risk management, you're at the end of the series, what we hope is that you are able to implement it into your operation, and it will help you with a bigger profit. And I think that's all I have to say, Harley.
Okay.
And if anybody has any more questions about Native Agriculture Financial Services, we can take those at the end of this.
So like I've told you, my name is Harley Moore Wilson. I am currently working on a doctorate in food science, specializing in food safety. I am doing a research project over indigenous food sources relating to bison production. And that bison production is the workers' health and safety along with the food safety aspect. I do have previous experience as a natural resources and food sovereignty director for my tribe. I'm a member of the Osage Nation. And since March, I have been operating my own LLC, focusing on minorities in agriculture and helping where I can and how I can. So we're going to get into the present today. What is a risk? You know, a risk is a chance of loss, the likelihood or probability of adverse outcomes. It could be uncertain consequences, or even exposure to hazard or potential loss. So there's a few easy ways to grasp the definition of risk, and it's the possibility of loss or the possibility of things that do not work out. There were almost 60,000 Native producers identified in the 2022 Ag Census. We're very well aware that there are a lot more Native producers than that 60,000 number. And NAFS also recognizes that. And so today we're going to be talking about production risk specifically, regards to food safety and how food safety fits into production risk. So production risk is any crop or livestock production related activity or event that is uncertain. So it could be anything that has a variable. So weather, disease, pest, a genetic variation. It could be equipment failure. It could be timing. Native farms have increased in size, but the number that filled out the Ag Census has decreased. So there are risks that are higher for farmers engaged in like a monoculture crop. A monoculture crop is like a one variety of species. And it could be because of any of those variabilities in production. So being able to decrease that risk could be as simple as giving yourself multiple areas of production. So what is food safety? It's a scientific method that describes handling, preparation, and storage of food in ways that prevent foodborne illnesses, such as bacteria, viruses, like E. coli or salmonella. And those are things that we'd be talking about in those case studies and at the end of the presentation. So you're probably sitting there thinking, why does food safety even matter? Food safety involves literally everyone. It could be from the farmer to the baby eating baby food or your grandparent. And you want to make sure that everyone is safe in regards to everyone has to eat to be able to fill themselves with nutrients. So all farms, regardless of size, location, or the commodities or produce grown, can reduce those food safety risks. The FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, was signed into law January of 2011 by President Obama. There are 7 primary rules that are included within this FSMA Act. Produce safety rule, the preventative controls for human foods, the preventative controls for animal foods, the foreign supplier verification program, accreditation of third-party auditors, sanitation, transport of human and animal foods, and prevention of international contamination. So these 7 rules, there are trainings specifically for each of those 7 rules that you can receive certifications for. And if you are interested into those 7 rules, at the end of the presentation, my email address is there. Please feel free to email me and I can help get you in the right location to be able to find those specific training opportunities. We will just be barely brushing the surface of some produce safety and what is involved with the produce safety rule. So some background, Indigenous people have been practicing food safety for thousands of years. I mean, you think about your ancestors and they knew how to handle the meat and handle the vegetables and be able to save seeds so that they were still viable for the next year. A lot of tribal growers now have started moving away from those traditional practices and more towards westernized practices. And there's been a lot of new challenges with moving towards westernized practices. And unfortunately, some tribal growers did not have the choice to move away from those traditional management practices. And so you see a trend of kind of being somewhere in the middle of wanting to utilize some of those stories that their ancestors had been passing down from generations to be able to put into play some of those traditional and westernized practices. So understanding food safety, you are the biggest important of food safety. You have the ability to prevent or reduce the risks on your own farm. You also know your farm and your practices the best. So do you understand what consequences come with those same practices? And unfortunately, it's your actions that directly impact the food safety and financial viability of your farm. So, food safety refers to the practices, conditions, and procedures used to prevent foodborne illnesses that ensure food is safe to consume at all stages from production to consumption. It involves controlling hazards and maintaining cleanliness, the proper handling in the entire food supply chain, including growing, harvesting, processing, packaging, transporting, storing, and even preparing the food. The goal to reduce the risks of contamination by biological, chemical, or even physical hazards are some of the things that we'll be talking about today. So here is our overview of the discussion today. Unfortunately, the biggest concerns in fresh produce are harmful bacteria, viruses, parasites, and food safety practices. Food safety practices can work with cultural and traditional farming practices, as well as those westernized practices. Produce safety can be challenging for a number of reasons. A couple of these reasons are because most produce, as far as fresh fruits and vegetables, don't go through a kill step. A kill step is, for example, a cooking step. So you're not going to cook your lettuce before you eat it. And because of that, there are a lot more harmful bacteria and a higher risk that bacteria could be on that. And contaminations are very sporadic. It could affect a very small portion of your crop. And so knowing which part of your crop has contamination is really difficult. So microorganisms are visually hard to see. I mean, it's in the name, micro, so very, very tiny. So it's not like you're going to be able to go out and see you have a cicada overload or grasshopper overload out in your plant crop, because these microorganisms are so tiny. And contamination is usually present at very, very low levels. So a rough surface produce or fruit, such as a cantaloupe that has all those pores, is a lot harder to clean than, per se, the smooth edges of a tomato. But a tomato has a lot of stem scars. Tomatoes get those ugly little cracks in the middle of them, and bacteria love that ugly little crack, and you can't hardly clean where that split is in tomato. Or even if you think about lettuce is kind of a rough textured, and there's a lot of folds in the lettuce, and so pathogens love to hide in that type of area. So today we'll be going over a little bit of worker health, hygiene, and training, some soil amendment information, wildlife and domesticated animals, and how that affects your land use. We'll be talking about agricultural water. So this will be pre-harvest and post-harvest water, post-harvest handling, and then talking about records, standard operating procedures, what you can do to minimize the risks on your farm, are just some of the things that we'll be discussing today. So contamination. On the farm, contamination can come from a number of sources. Do you have any of these items on your operation? Water, workers, soil, tools, or even animals? Well, of course you have those things on your farm. That's what makes a farm a farm. So this is why every single agricultural producer really needs to understand what are food safety risks and how you can reduce these risks. Contamination can be spread through workers, such as improper health or hygiene practices, or even illness or injury. Soil amendments, such as raw manure, when it's applied too close to harvest, or if there's the ability to run off, or wind spread, there's sources of contamination. Animals, both domesticated, livestock, and wild animals, can carry and transmit pathogens to your produce. Water can carry and spread human pathogens and can contaminate entire fields or large amounts of produce. So you want to be able to, while I'm presenting today, think about these contamination sources on your own farm and think about what cross-contamination is. Cross-contamination is the contamination of one surface that then touches the produce. And raw or cooked foods, they must be stored and prepared separately to prevent these harmful microorganisms from spreading to the ready-to-eat items. So, cross-contamination can really happen with your clothing, your shoes, your hands, if you have gloves on, tools, or equipment. So when we're talking about worker health and hygiene, you really want to understand the potential routes of contamination so that then you can train your employees. Having the appropriate health and hygiene practices, uh, unfortunately, this sounds silly, but you really need to, in that training, teach your employees how to have a proper hand washing station and how they wash their hands. I've always been told to sing the happy birthday song twice, and you really have to scrub. And then after you're scrubbing, you want to use that paper towel to go ahead and scrub some more. That is to continue to get the rest of the bacteria or germs off of your hands. If you just were to air dry, there will still be bacteria residue there. It kind of a fun fact, but OSHA, it requires one restroom facility for every 20 workers within a quarter mile of the working area. And so, if your fields are 5 minutes from your office building, OSHA requires you to have some type of restroom at that field location. And that is because you don't want workers, going off into the bushes to use the bathroom. Then there's nowhere to A, wash your hands, or B, that fecal contamination could then run off into your fields. Uh, and then, I will talk about within each of these slides the corrective actions in record keeping. And at the very end, I will go into depth about corrective actions in record keeping. But, Native producers carry significant and cultural roles into their communities. Foods are known as our medicine. And so personal hygiene, you want to make sure it's really great, and understanding that your food handlers must wash your hands. They need to utilize clean surfaces and equipment. They need to wear the appropriate protective clothing. So if it's gloves or hairnets to prevent contamination. Humans can carry pathogens and spread them to produce, food contact surfaces, or to other people even while they work on the farm. Pathogens are most commonly spread directly or indirectly by fecal matter, but they can be spread through saliva, mucus, or other bodily fluids such as blood. Workers who have direct contact with produce activities such as harvesting and packing have the highest potential for contaminating. However, you still have to think about others that are on your farm, such as visitors that can contaminate that produce. And so when you're thinking about having visitors on your farm, you definitely want to make sure that you are educating those individuals as they come into your facilities to decrease that risk of contamination. Another thought is gloves. Gloves carry a lot of bacteria because you're not washing those gloves every single time you touch something new. So that is a source of cross contamination. And so I see a lot of people asking their employees to not wear gloves, instead provide hand washing machines, so that they're constantly washing their hands before they change produce or change fields even, or are harvesting, to continue to decrease that contamination process. So hand washing, I've made it sure it's very important. You always want to wash your hands after you use the bathroom. Uh, a lot of people don't think about washing their hands maybe before but when returning to start work. And I've been known to do this too. You get out of your car, you're running real late, and you don't take the time to spend the 30 to 45 seconds really washing your hands. And so then you have all of those cross contamination points of contact, such as your steering wheel, the door handle on your vehicle, the door handle in your processing facilities. And then if you were to contaminate, think about all the cross contamination points that could occur if your hands were contaminated instead of washing them before or when you return to work. We think about washing your hands before we eat, but we don't really necessarily think about washing our hands after we're eating or even smoking. If you go have employees that go on a smoke break, definitely encourage them to be washing their hands after they go on their smoke break. You want to wash your hands before or after putting your gloves on, touching animals, or even animal feces. Unfortunately, if an animal defecates in the fields, you're going to have to clean it up. Or at any other point in time where your hands might be contaminated. So some soil amendments, soil amendments are any type of material that is intentionally added to the soil. There are three types of soil amendments. You have biological, chemical, and physical. Your biological amendments are your highest risk of contamination through human pathogens. And that's because it's like, for example, manure or composting. Chemical and physical soil amendments have a pretty low risk, but those chemical amendments are really high risk to your employees, so such as fertilizers. So those physical soil amendments have the lowest risk of containing human pathogens. You really want to make sure when you're adding any type of soil amendment that you are reading the label and applying how the label tells you to apply. If there are PPEs that are needed to utilize those PPEs, especially if you are utilizing a chemical soil amendment. So, we understand that risks associated with these pathogens aren't new, but they are changing over time. It's just like any virus that, what might have worked as far as medication 5 years ago, post-COVID, it's not working. And our soil and those pathogens that are within the soil and these soil amendments are always changing over time. So your biggest contamination source would be the raw manure, because it represents a significant microbial risk to fresh produce, since animal manures can contain human pathogens. Manure is a very valuable source to farms, and making sure that your soil has the proper nutrients. And there are ways, such as composting or by extending the time between your application of the manure on your field and the harvest date, that do help reduce your food safety risks when you're using this manure as a soil amendment. So some regulations that state that the raw manure must be composted unless you're incorporating it into the soil at least 120 days before harvest of a product with direct contact to the soil. So you could think about potatoes or carrots, or incorporated into the soil at least 90 days before harvest of a product that does not have direct contact with the soil. So I think of tomatoes would be another one. So as long as if you're using a raw manure, you need to be incorporating that more than 90 days before your first harvest. Animals, wildlife, and domesticated animals have the ability to spread and carry human pathogens. I'm going to start off by saying that tribes have such a unique relationship with animals and understanding their cultural significance, and helping how to relate animals to the present food safety. It is hard environment to show. So we do have some co-management strategies, which takes in consideration both food safety along with conservation efforts. Domesticated animals, such as dogs, cattle, horses, have the ability to carry human pathogens through their feces. And this can be spread through cross-contamination if, per se, I know my horses like to roll. They were to roll in feces and then go through your field and brush up against, say, a corn stalk. You have the ability to have a large risk of contamination at that point. So when you're thinking about providing a direct source that decrease the amount of contamination, because I understand that you're needing to utilize these domesticated animals to help work your fields. Having specific paths designated for those animals will really help. If an animal were to defecate on that path, making sure that you have specific tools to clean that up and that you're not using the same wheelbarrow to A, harvest your produce, and B, clean up the manure that just occurred that you're trying to get out of your field, because that is a really big source of cross contamination. And so there's these ways that it can be done to minimize the risks. Now, wildlife is a lot harder to control. I mean, there are deterrents. So bird deterrence, the first thing I think of, is a scarecrow out there in the field. And that works some, or I've seen lots of farmers go get the little blow up man from the car sales lot and utilize him because he flops in the wind a little bit more. But then you think about deer. Your fencing is expensive. So how are you going to minimize the risk of deer entering your field? Because you have absolutely no idea where they've been, what is on their fur that they could transfer into your fields, on their hooves. And so thinking about deer, a lot of people are planting a exterior plant specifically for wildlife in hopes that the wildlife eat that exterior boundary of planting and don't go into the middle where they're actually harvesting. And wild hogs are the same way. They're just really hard to control, very expensive to try to manage. And so you just definitely want to understand what risks are there. I've known hogs to go in and destroy a whole watermelon field overnight, and unfortunately, that's a food safety risk because if there's any watermelon left, you're risking contamination, but then you're also risking a financial risk with this wildlife. So just making sure that you understand that the produce can be contaminated directly or indirectly by the feces of these animals through contamination from the animals themselves, water sources, or cross-contamination from the wildlife movements. So ag water. Most indigenous tribes do have treaties that refer to water rights. We want to help keep the water protected and safe, not only for food safety practices, but for cultural practices too. And water can be used in many ways, not only on the farm, but in our everyday life. But on the farm specifically, we can think about, anything from irrigation on the left to washing produce on the right. Water is unfortunately a really great vehicle for carrying and spreading human pathogens if that water becomes contaminated at any point. Water can become contaminated at the source. So, for example, at the well or at a pond or a stream or any point in that distribution and use. So if you're irrigating, it could become contaminated because of a bad pipe or a crack in the pipe. So we'll be talking a little bit about pre-harvest water along with some post-harvest water. So pre-harvest water is water that's used in contact with the produce during the growth. And then post-water harvest water is used after harvest in the processing stage. So understanding with your pre-harvest water, the less contact with the water, the lower the risk. So when we're thinking about less contact, unfortunately, the on top of the ground irrigation system is pretty high risk because that water is getting all over the leaves, all over the produce that's in your field. A drip system is by far the lowest risk of contamination. So when we're thinking about pre-harvest water, there are typically 3 sources of water: public water, so that would be your city or rural municipal water; groundwater, so well water; or surface water, such as ponds and streams. We're talking about some application methods, such as, like I was saying, the picture shows that the water is touching your harvestable portion of the crop, whereas a drip system, it doesn't touch that harvestable portion of a crop. And then you want to understand that timing of application. So the more days between the last water application and your harvest also reduce the risks. But understand, like surface water, it really can be utilized in the production of produce, but growers, you should be very aware of the microbial quality and risks that exist. So it could be as simple as taking water samples and sending off to your local extension agents, and being able to understand what you have in that water and keeping a record of it to see if there are any outliers at any point. Understanding that contaminated ag water has been implicated in some foodborne illness outbreaks associated with fresh produce. You do want to manage that water on a long-term basis to be able to reduce the risks. So I was just telling you about keeping a record of your testing. If you have a public water that you're using, feel free to always go to your town or rural municipal, and they have to already test that water. So you don't have to pay for it. You can just ask for the results and keep a log to be able to see if there are any outliers at that point. And surface water. Surface water is going to be making sure groundwater and surface water, you're going to send off those water samples to make sure that there are no harmful bacteria present. And I'm just going to give you a little tidbit here. I live in Hominy, Oklahoma, and this past late spring, early summer, we had an E. coli outbreak in our water system. And so we had a boil alert for a month and a half, which then meant that we weren't able to utilize any of our public water, the city water, to water our produce, water our animals, water ourselves. And that was because of the runoff. We had so much rain in a short amount of time, our lagoons had overflown and got into our public water source. And so it can happen, and you just have to kind of be very prepared for that to happen. So post-water management, it can help prevent small contaminations from becoming a very big contamination. Just like I talked about, unfortunately, we could do nothing about the E. coli outbreak that happened here in Hominy, but managing the water and adding sanitation into that water helps minimize those risks. So the water is, you change your water, you have disposal of the water, and your surface water. And when you're disposing of some post-harvest water, say that you've added your sanitizers in to be able to clean these vegetables, you don't want to just go dump it outside, because that sanitizer may end up in your field and kill part of your produce. Or if that water had any type of microbial contamination, when you're dumping it out and the runoff ends up in your field, you're contaminating another source of your produce, you do want to have regularly scheduled water changes. Just in the event that there was a contamination source, you're not spreading it through a whole day's worth of harvest, but just a portion of that day. And some things to monitor when you're dealing with post water harvest water is like the pH levels. You could go as simple as getting those little pH paper strips that I know that everybody has had used at one point or another. Using a thermometer to check the temperature of the water, and then the turbidity is a lot harder to check because most of us are not utilizing, glass bowls, and we're not letting that sediment settle within the water to understand how dirty or gross the water is. So there are turbidity readers that you can get on Amazon that are pretty cheap to be able to know those items. So when you're handling your produce post-harvest, understand that cleaning and sanitizing are two completely different things. You have to clean before you sanitize because you can't sanitize a dirty surface. Keeping things organized will help keep a clean area. You want to make sure that you have the proper facilities, so such as bathrooms or kitchen facilities. Some pest management practices are good. And no standing water. Native people have managed trade routes for thousands of years, which includes harvesting, packaging, and even transporting agricultural products safely. But there are different risks today when handling these products. So we have some things such as temperature control, foods that must be stored at appropriate temperatures to slow the growth of pathogens. So a fridge or freezer, understanding that refrigerated foods should be kept below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and frozen foods should be kept below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And when foods are kept in those temperature controlled areas, you still have to keep, we always utilized a first in, first out method. So this practice would ensure, the older stock is being used before the newer stock. And if you think about a grocery store, I'm always the person who's digging in the back of the milk section to get the milk that lasts the longest at my house. It's the same way when you're dealing with your produce. You want to be able to get that older produce out the door first, but you want to make sure to keep those temperature controlled areas very clean. So we're going to talk about a little bit of risk management. You really need to understand what risks are on your farm before you begin implementing produce safety. I 100% understand that many farms have really limited resources. So you want to start with identifying your biggest risks and working to minimize those large risks first. And really, most farms are implementing practices to reduce produce safety, and you might not even realize it. So some risks that you might consider are the location of your property. So if your property is in a valley, what are your neighbors that are above you in elevation doing? Is the runoff, if a big rainstorm happens, going to affect your produce? The fecal contamination of animals, both domesticated and wildlife, your water, workers, training and hygiene, some practices utilized. So are you using best management practices, or are we lacking or doing things more of the lazy way or the shortcut way? And flooding situations, are you near a surface water such as a river or stream that could possibly flood the banks, which then that flood water could get all over your produce and contaminate your produce? So when implementing some practices, your goal is to prevent the contamination, and you may be modifying your current practices. That it may not be a huge thing to modify the current practices you're doing, but just add a little tweak to it. So standard operating procedures, which I will refer to as SOPs, they're a guide to outline what needs to be done and how to perform them. There's two things. You want them clear and you want them concise. SOPs, they can help implement good agricultural practices and ensure that practices are done properly. When thinking of an SOP, think of it as a receipt for your car. It provides a step-by-step instruction on how to complete a task that needs to be done for produce safety. So this could include where the supplies are located, to complete the task, and how often a task should be completed. You definitely want to practice writing standard operating procedures. It's a very great learning exercise, and it helps refine some instructions to get the job done properly. And so some other things within a standard operating procedure is you want to make sure that your employees are reading labels accurately or putting labels on your produce accurately. So making sure you understand that food products, they need a clear and concise, accurate labeling system, which would include ingredients and an expiration date and potential allergens. Undeclared allergens can pose really serious health risks with people with food allergies. Another thing that you want to add is making sure that you have some expiration dates, use by or sell by dates. I'm really sorry, I got a tickle in my throat. So if you're labeling these dates accurately, you can pretty much avoid potentially hazardous food, and you're being very clear and concise with your consumers at the front end. So corrective actions help fix a problem, determine a cause, or modify your practices. There are both short and long-term planning corrective actions. You do want to try to establish corrective actions before the problem happens. Corrective action plans should be directed toward fixing the problem and helping identify an underlying issue to reduce the likelihood that the problem will occur again. Corrective actions can be established in advance for problems that are reasonably likely to happen, such as too little sanitizer to add to your wash water, which is your post-harvest ag water. Some events, it can help predict problems that may occur. So corrective actions may need to be developed after a problem has been identified. We can't all know what's going to happen every single day, and that's okay. And just making sure that if you see a new problem arises, after that problem's arise, go ahead and create a corrective action plan for that. And when you're monitoring those logs and different things, that will help you really be able to identify when a corrective action is needed. As a grower, you can have a plan for responding when unexpected events occur. So I like to think of most unexpected events occurring in regards to weather. We don't know what the weather is going to do, and unfortunately our weather keeps getting crazier and crazier. But you can have a plan to be able to respond to that unexpected event. It just doesn't have to be specific. Understanding that a corrective action could be a food recall. Food recalls are an essential part of food safety when a product is being found potentially harmful. You want to make sure that there are swift actions taken to remove the product from the market to prevent harm to consumers. And, like I discussed, in our different regional outbreaks in today's session, we will be discussing some of those recalls and what a recall even is, but you can have a plan in place to understand what to do if you were to have a recall within your facility. And record keeping is extremely important in helping manage your food safety. And this could include documentation from practices, monitoring, corrective actions. This provides really hard data to take to your lenders to show, it shows on average what your facility has grown. It shows how you've decreased your risks. You can make record keeping really easy and useful. There are tons of templates out there. You can just take those templates and tailor them to your farm because there's no need to reinvent the wheel. It's a really easy way to make sure that food safety practices are occurring. You want to keep those logs by or near where the task needs to be accomplished. So, for example, a task that could be accomplished would be cleaning the bathrooms. And you want to make sure that that log is on the door of the bathroom or somewhere nearby, because more than likely the employee who cleaned that bathroom is not going to take the time to go 5 minutes to the office or to the vehicle where that log may live. So making sure you're very intentional on where you put the logs. Another log would be watering and testing the water. So that log may be in the office when you're receiving those water sampling reports back and keeping that. You do want to have on your log a date and signature from the person who did the specific activity, as well as a date and signature from the supervisor when the logs are reviewed. And the logs don't have to be reviewed daily. At my old job, I reviewed logs on a weekly basis and some logs on a bi-weekly basis. Just to note, per the FDA's Produce Safety Rule 112-164, all your logs must be kept for at least 2 years past the date the record was created. So, and your records can be stored off-site as long as they can be really retrieved easily. And there's so many benefits to record keeping, and this helps you be sure that the task was completed and done properly. It helps you identify those outliers or trends that may cause some future problems. And at this point, I think Ms. Sandy wanted to talk a little bit about how record keeping and food safety ties into lending. Maybe not. Ridge, is that something you can talk about? Oh, Sandy's here.
Harley, sorry. I took my earbuds out for a minute and then I couldn't get them back in.
That's okay.
What was your question?
No, I was just asking if you wanted to describe a little bit about how record keeping and food safety is important to lenders.
Yes. So looking at it from a lender's perspective, if you're coming in and talking to your lender about a potential loan or borrowing some money, and you come in with records showing the food safety practices that you have going on your farm, your food safety records, all the record keeping that Harley was just talking about, how you're following all the standards, you've got your porta potties in place, your hand washing stations in place, per the regulations, and that you're practicing all of this. When the lenders look at that, they're going to go, okay, this person really cares about what is happening on their farm and that they are producing a safe product and they're mitigating their risk. Most importantly, they're mitigating their risk. And so lenders are going to be able to check that box. It's one of many boxes to check, but it will help you when you talk to your borrower.
Well, thank you, Miss Sandy. So in summary, produce safety impacts every single farm. Outbreaks also impact the health of every consumer from young to old. You want to reduce the confidence in produce and influence the consumption decisions for people to buy your product. So just as Miss Sandy was saying on a lender's side, it's great to show all these produce safety that you're doing, but a consumer should look at that too because they want to know what's going into your body. So therefore, you have the ability to affect the financial viability of your farm. It just depends on the produce safety. And unfortunately, an outbreak really can impact your cells. So commitment to those food safety practices is very critical to the success of every single farm food safety program. And your leadership should be provided to guide and implement and manage the produce safety practices on each farm. So make sure that you never underestimate the value of setting a good example for your employees to follow, because unfortunately, contamination comes from everywhere and you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. So I just really want to thank you guys for joining us today. Please don't leave us because we're going to go into outbreak sessions. But we do have some upcoming webinars, pretty much the Thursday of every single month. That QR code is a registration. Here is my specific contact information. Feel free to send me any emails with any questions that you have. If I don't have the answers, I will find the answers for you. And at this point, I'm going to give you guys about 5 minutes. If you could scan the QR code for me and take the post-survey quiz. And this is before we start our breakout rooms. I'm going to start setting up the breakout rooms and get everybody into position. And I do have the ability to